Thanks, Merv. Good morning, everybody. I'm Christopher Ewing and I'm a Senior Project Manager at CO2 Australia. I'm responsible for looking after all our environmental offset projects in Australia. Today I'm going to share my thoughts with you on the past, present and future of environmental offsets here in Queensland. So if we look to the past, in 2012 a colleague and I gave a presentation entitled Environmental Offsets, the Curly Questions. In it we posed 4 curly questions about the way environmental offsets were being used at the time. Here they are. So number 1, are projects following a strict avoid and minimise framework? Number 2, will offsets counterbalance unavoidable negative impacts on the environment and protect at-risk environmental values? Number 3, are offsets being used appropriately by regulators when conditioning projects? And number 4, will long-term monitoring of offsets be sufficient to allow measurement of outcomes? My point being, 7 years later, those questions are as valid now as they were then. So bear those in mind as we go through the session. So let's have a look at what we know after a couple of decades of doing offsets here in Australia. Well, first off, they're very popular. The number of countries with government policies on biodiversity offsets has doubled in the past 15 years. There are almost 100 offset programs in 33 countries around the world. All states and territories here in Australia have introduced environmental offset frameworks in some shape or form. Here in Queensland, between July 2014 and June 2018, approximately 156 approvals were granted for projects with an offset condition. On average, that's 3 a month. They're time consuming. I've been doing this for a decade, and there are projects that have moved from an environmental impact statement all the way through to operation, but they still haven't found their required environmental offsets yet. They're costly. Environmental offsets for significant projects run into the tens of millions of dollars over their life and represent a serious long-term commitment of resources. The outcomes are uncertain. There's a myriad of research out there that points to the questionable and unknown results of environmental offsets. While environmental offsets are increasingly being used by governments and companies, an IUCN study found current efforts were proving insufficient to reduce biodiversity decline. So what are the major problems? Well, these are as I see them. First off, supply. There are insufficient viable environmental offsets to efficiently meet demand. In my experience, this is a result of landholder disengagement, legal and contractual complexity, competition from alternative land uses, and structural impediments to market participation. Second, the integrity of any conservation benefit. There's tremendous uncertainty about whether the offsets we establish today will actually achieve the very lofty ambitions we have for them, be it no net loss or even a conservation gain. Numerous scientific papers lament this very issue. Even though every single offset I have worked on has a monitoring regime over years and years involving rigorous scientific methods, who is looking at this information? Who's even doing it? Who's working out whether this system is actually delivering and what our opportunities are to improve it? Third, transaction costs. Acquiring environmental offsets is a costly business. However, significant costs are associated with the process rather than the actual delivery of conservation outcomes. For example, there are projects in Queensland that have prepared environmental offset strategies, environmental offset management plans, and other offset documents for government approval, submitted them, and then gone into a long back and forth with government with comments and responses. It can take months or even years to resolve. Sometimes we see upwards of 10 revisions of a document that refers to the same offset site, managed the same way for the same period with unchanged completion criteria in every one of those 10 revisions. That's great for consultants and lawyers, but I cannot see how this does anything to help deliver a conservation benefit. If we look globally, every jurisdiction is trying to do the same thing. Balance the need for development with the need to do something about our ever-worsening environment. So what do we do? Well, first off, we need to refocus our efforts. Proponents and governments must adhere to the offset hierarchy. So I mean, first you avoid, and I mean you actually avoid. then you minimise to the greatest extent you can, and only then should you consider offsetting the truly unavoidable impacts. We need to remember our aim with environmental offsets is to have our cake and eat it too. From all the things being built around the place, it's clear we have got the metaphorical cake eating down to a fine art. However, if we look at the worsening environmental problems around us, we must quickly start to deliver on the conservation benefits. We have to focus our investment on the things that actually benefit the environment rather than paying ever-increasing transaction costs. That means we have to refocus on the actual outcomes we want from offsets. Secondly, we need to get the right people in at the right time. Environmental offsets are long-term, high-risk and expensive. That means they will need to be well understood by senior company executives from the very beginning rather than being bundled up with the rest of a project's environmental approvals. Commercial people need to be making decisions from the start, and they must, and I cannot underline this point enough, must understand the significant risks and benefits companies are looking at when they're dealing with environmental offsets. This is no different to the way large companies now deal with carbon offsets and other key sustainability issues. And finally, we have to avoid despair. We need to remember that environmental offsets, while not free of pitfalls, offer an unrivaled opportunity to devote meaningful resources to conservation. Our challenge is to focus those resources in the most effective way to ensure we're actually making things better. As I look around this room, I see a lot of clever people, all of whom want to do things better. That's why we all came to this conference. It gives me great hope. Human beings are capable of seemingly impossible things when we put our collective minds to the task. For example, on the screen, we have a space shuttle being carried by a 747. Imagine if I showed that picture to the Wright brothers. They'd be blown away. Look at what humanity achieved in less than 100 years. It makes delivering environmental offsets properly seem totally doable. Thanks very much.